1915. A wooden ship lies crushed in the ice at the bottom of the world, and 28 men are left stranded on a drifting floe, 1,000 miles from the nearest human being. What happens next is the greatest survival story ever told. Their ship was gone. No one in the world knew where they were. No one was coming to save them. And their leader made a promise that every single one of them would come home alive. Chapter 1. The Boldest Plan. By 1914, the South Pole had been reached. So Sir Ernest Shackleton set his sights on the one great prize left in Antarctica, to be the first to cross the entire frozen continent on foot from sea to sea. This was not Shackleton's first time in the ice. Years earlier, he had marched to within 100 miles of the South Pole, closer than anyone before him, and turned back rather than let his men starve. He knew, better than most, exactly what Antarctica could do to a person. The plan was breathtakingly bold. One ship would carry his team deep into the Weddell Sea to a landing point near the coast. From there, they would march more than 1,500 miles across the pole to the far side of the continent. His ship was named Endurance after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." It was one of the strongest wooden ships ever built. Shackleton would need every inch of that strength. 28 men sailed with him: sailors, scientists, a surgeon, and a photographer named Frank Hurley, whose camera would make this expedition immortal. In December 1914, they left the island of South Georgia and turned south into the ice. They carried 69 sled dogs for the Great Crossing, and the men grew to love them. It is a measure of how badly things would go that, months later, out on the ice, those same dogs would have to be shot for food. Nothing about this expedition went to plan. Chapter 2. Trapped. The Weddell Sea is one of the most treacherous stretches of water on Earth, a slowly churning trap of pack ice. Endurance pushed deeper and deeper, weaving between the floes, until, just one day's sail from land, the ice closed around her. The temperature dropped and the sea froze solid around the hull. The ship was stuck fast, as Shackleton put it, like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. She wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. There was nothing to do but wait, and hope the ice would release them in the spring. Instead, the whole frozen sheet began to drift, carrying the ship, slowly, helplessly, hundreds of miles in the wrong direction. Then came the Antarctic winter, and with it the long polar night, weeks of unbroken darkness and cold beyond imagining. To keep the men sane, Shackleton kept them busy, fed, and together. Hurley, working in the dark and the freezing cold, took some of the most beautiful photographs ever made. Shackleton understood that the real enemy was not the cold but despair. So he built a routine: hot meals, football on the ice, songs and lectures in the evenings, anything to keep 28 trapped men from turning on one another in the dark. Chapter 3. The Ship Dies. When the spring came, it brought not freedom but destruction. The drifting floes began to grind together, and the ship was caught in the middle. Millions of tons of ice bore down on the wooden hull. The men fought to save her, hacking at the ice, working the pumps around the clock. But it was hopeless. The timbers groaned and screamed and began to splinter. Water poured in. On the 27th of October, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. For weeks the wreck stayed jammed in the ice. Then, on the 21st of November, the men watched their ship, their home, their only way out, finally slip beneath the ice and disappear. "She's gone, boys," Shackleton said quietly. They were now utterly alone. From the wreck they dragged out everything that might keep them alive: 3 lifeboats, tents, tools, and all the food they could haul. Shackleton set the example, throwing his own gold coins and even a Bible into the snow. Survival now meant traveling light. Chapter 4. Life on the Ice. Home was now a camp of flimsy tents pitched on a raft of floating ice, 6 feet thick, that could crack apart beneath them at any moment. They had salvaged 3 small lifeboats, some food, and Hurley's precious photographs. And they waited. For nearly 5 months they drifted on the ice, living on seal and penguin meat, their flow slowly carrying them north toward open water. Shackleton's single obsession was to hold the group together and to keep hope alive. They named their second home Patience Camp, and patience was all they had. For 3 more months the ice carried them north, the food dwindling, the men scanning the horizon for the open water that meant both escape and terrible danger. Then, in April 1916, the ice they were standing on began to shatter. Cracks split the camp apart. It was time, long past time, to take to the boats and trust 3 tiny wooden shells against the most violent ocean on the planet. Chapter 5, To Elephant Island. What followed was a nightmare of a week. 3 open boats, packed with exhausted, frost-bitten men, rowing and sailing through freezing spray, killer whales surfacing around them. No sleep, no dry clothes, no certainty that any land even lay ahead. At last they reached Elephant Island, a bleak, storm-battered rock, but it was land. For the first time in 497 days, the men stood on solid ground. Some wept, some simply lay down and pressed their faces to the earth. And yet they were still doomed. Elephant Island was uninhabited, far from any shipping route. No one would ever find them here. If they wanted to live, someone would have to go and get help across 800 miles of the deadliest sea on Earth. Shackleton chose 5 men to go with him, and left the rest under his most trusted friend, Frank Hurley. To Hurley fell the hardest task of all, to keep 22 men alive and sane on that frozen beach, for as long as it took, with no way of knowing if rescue would ever come. Chapter 6, The Impossible Voyage. The nearest help was a whaling station on the island of South Georgia, the very island they had left, a year and a half before. To reach, it meant crossing 800 miles of open ocean in a 22-foot lifeboat, through the roaring winds and mountainous waves of the Southern Ocean. It was very nearly suicide. It was also their only chance. They chose the sturdiest of the 3 boats, the James Caird, and made her ready. On the 24th of April, Shackleton and 5 men pushed off from Elephant Island and set their course for South Georgia. The 22 who stayed behind watched them shrink to a speck and vanish. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, had raised the little boat's sides and decked her over with scraps of wood and canvas, caulked with seal blood and oil paint. It was crude and it was brilliant. That improvised deck was all that stood between 6 men and the Southern Ocean. For 16 days they were battered by hurricane winds and waves the size of buildings. They belayed constantly to keep from sinking. Ice coated the boat until it threatened to capsize them, and they hacked it away with frozen hands. Frank Hurley navigated the whole way, with a handful of glimpses of the sun. That he found a speck of an island in that chaos, across 800 miles of ocean, is one of the greatest feats of navigation in history. On the 10th of May, half dead from thirst and cold, they crawled ashore on South Georgia. Chapter 7, The Crossing. But the ordeal was not over. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station and Salvation lay on the far coast, and between them rose a range of jagged, unmapped mountains and glaciers that no one had ever crossed. Leaving their weakest men behind, Shackleton, Hurley, and Crean set out with 50 feet of rope and a carpenter's adze. For 36 hours straight without rest, they climbed and slid and stumbled across the mountainous spine of South Georgia, at one point sliding down a glacier in the dark, not knowing what lay below. On the morning of the 20th of May, 3 ragged, blackened, half-frozen figures walked into the whaling station at Stromness. The first men to see them did not recognize them as human. Shackleton had done the impossible, but he was not finished. Chapter 8, Bring Them Home. 22 men were still stranded on Elephant Island, waiting under 2 upturned boats, eating penguins, scanning the empty horizon. Shackleton tried again and again to reach them, and 4 times the pack ice turned him back. On Elephant Island, Frank Hurley held the men together through storm and starvation. Every single morning for 4.5 months, he rolled up his sleeping bag and told them the same thing. Get ready, the boss may come today. Finally, borrowing a small Chilean steamer called the Yelcho, he broke through. On the 30th of August 1916, 4.5 months after the James Caird had sailed, the marooned men saw a ship on the horizon and Shackleton standing on the deck, counting. "Are you all well?" he shouted across the water. "All safe, all well," came the answer. Every single man was alive. After nearly 2 years lost at the bottom of the world, Shackleton had kept his impossible promise. He had not lost a single one of them. Chapter 9. By endurance we conquer. Frank Hurley had saved just over 100 of his glass photographic plates, smashing the rest so he would not be tempted to carry too many. Those images, the frozen ship, the endless ice, the tiny figures against the white, are why we can still see this story today. Shackleton never reached the South Pole. He never crossed Antarctica. By the measure of his own goals, the expedition was a total failure. And yet he is remembered as one of the greatest leaders who ever lived, because when everything fell apart, he brought his people home. Shackleton could never quite leave the ice. In 1922, on yet another voyage south, his heart finally gave out. At his wife's wish, they buried him on South Georgia, the island that had been his salvation, facing the wild ocean he had crossed. And the Endurance herself. For more than a century she lay lost, 3,000 meters down in the freezing dark of the Weddell Sea. Then, in 2022, searchers found her, astonishingly, almost perfectly preserved, her name still clear across the stern. The ship that would not quit, still standing at the bottom of the world. His family motto had named the ship, and it named the whole ordeal. 4 simple words that carried 28 men across 2 years of ice and ocean and darkness. By endurance, we conquer. They set out to cross a continent and failed. Instead, they gave the world something rarer, proof of what human beings can endure and what a leader will do to keep a promise. This has been WeThoth. If this story moved you, subscribe, and we will meet again at the next turning point in history.